Sunny Saturday. No, that's the tea. And it's my pleasure this morning to introduce to you Dr. Viva Bala. Is it who is a professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies. She has her PhD in History and Urban Studies from Michigan State University. Her research focuses on gender, migration, and urban studies. She integrates community-based learning in her teaching, resulting in university and community-wide events focusing on immigration and refugees. Last year, she organized a photo exhibit and a migrant one-day conference. We're looking forward to hearing about India, between China, the West, and the Gulf.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. How are you all? I'm going to begin like that. I'm treating this as my classroom. And I'm going to begin with things that I always ask my class students to begin. Anything happening in the neighborhood, in the world that we need to know and talk about. Besides India. And that's how I make my students aware of what's happening globally. They need to focus on the subject. If I'm teaching a class on gender migration, they need to bring stories about, our Asian American, they need to bring stories about that and we begin with the class with that. So anything happening in India or in Asia that we need to know or talk about. They're following on the map, they're actually coming up the map. So you guys failed the test. I read news voraciously, so yes, sir.
Years ago, I was a substitute teacher in a school in Michigan, an upscale school. And probably third or fourth graders, they were supposed to each give a little talk. There was a Sikh boy in the class, there was a Hindu boy in the class, and I almost had to separate. I mean, they were so even at their age, they were almost ready to have a fist fight. So how much of a problem is that?
It depends what you're talking about, the Sikh problem in 1980s, where Sikh separatists wanted to start a new, separate from India and start a nation. They also, these tensions resulted in the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi, if you remember.
Yeah.
And subsequently, this movement has subsided in India, but it's growing in Canada. And this Khalistan movement, as it's known as, it's very active in Canada, especially in the religious and Gurdwaras. And also in the US, one of the leaders of the separatist movement has US citizenship, joined US and Canadian or something, and towards the end of this essay, it's briefly mentioned. And seems, it's never been confirmed, that India tried to assassinate or had hired somebody to assassinate him, and the person was caught in Czech Republic. And my information on this comes from Washington Post. I have a huge article on this. And so this tension has led to deterioration of relations between India and Canada. In fact, the diplomatic staff was expelled from both nations. Canada expelled the top diplomat and others because they were seen as complicit in this plan. And in fact, few Sikh activists were assassinated in British Columbia, in Surrey. And Canada thinks it's the Indians. India had a hand in their assassination. And so Canada diplomatic staff is at its lowest ever. Really bad relationships. And it's really surprising because Indian diaspora in Canada is huge. People want to, go for vacations, meet family members, and the consular staff is so limited that the visas and any kind of tourist or permanent, they are just right now. Stopped, things are moving very slowly because I've got hundreds of people. There will be about 10 or 20 people, maybe 20 people in the Canadian island. And it's so, and US, India couldn't argue with US because US has evidence. It seems, but it's being put aside right now, given the new developing relations between India and Canada. So, so this separatist movement, probably what you're talking about, those two kids, could be part of the separatist, you know, the families talk about it, and you, the kids understand and try to act on their own way. But this problem in some way exists even now, but it's more in American hemisphere than in India at this point.
Always been true, living parallel for 30 years of volunteer over a year ago. But, and at University of Northern Canada, there were foreign students, and happened to be one of them. And Hindu and a Muslim were both discussing with a small group. And they had the impression that the and away when India became independent, not to get India so strong, it's to make a break. Is that true that the religious differences were more after somebody decided to partition them?
So the partition happened. The decision for partition came from was a British decision, right? And this decision was India became independent in 1947. And the idea of Pakistan did not emerge till late 1930s. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who's known as the founding father of Pakistan, was for the longest time was part of the Indian National Congress that wanted independence. And the story goes, historians say that at one point, Jinnah did not get the presidentship of Congress party. And so there's a friction between the two factions. And this friction leads to the demand for Muslim Pakistan. Although if you know anything about Muhammad Ali Jinnah, he was such a cosmopolitan person. Religion didn't really matter to him. He was born. I mean, so within 8 years, the Britishers listened to that demand and created two nations, right? That became their solution. There's a and then the division was it's the 1947 clashes that occurred and the people were assassinated randomly based on their religion. It became so the partition is one of the worst time in Indian history. You can hear stories. My dad was 13 years old. He was visiting Pakistan where his elder brother was working at the time. And he tells the story of coming on a train. And those, you know, there are a few movies made on this. If you want to see a movie, there's a movie called Earth. That is made by Deepa Mehta, who now lives in so maybe on Netflix you get to see the movie Earth. It tells the story. It's from a book by Bakshi Silwala, and the name of the book is I forget. I'll send it if you're interested. I have a copy in my home, but I have it's a book by Bakshi Silwala, and it's just based on a true story of this writer, and it's about her nanny and her friends. And it is individual stories, but it is also a larger story of what is happening. And one of the largest refugee migration occurred after that, when Indians, before that, it was more ethnically divided. North India is, there's Punjab, and a lot of Punjabis lived in Pakistan. In every northern family I'm trying to say had connections in Pakistan. Pakistan wasn't seen as a separate area, right? And so people moved back and forth. My great grandma always complained about my grandfather. He sent the family earlier, but they had their old ancestral home. She says, we had such huge pots, and the kitchen stuff. He never brought that, he only brought his books, right? And his library, it came in huge trunks and stuff, right? He transferred that, but he didn't think to go to the kitchen and bring all those huge pots and stuff, right? So, families were divided, people lost property, and I think about 14 to 15 million people migrated to this area, right? There was a lot of carnage in any war situation that you see nowadays. Attacks on women, that also happened. So there's a lot written. It's sort of a dark moment in Indian history, but there's a lot has been written on that, and it's still coming out every day, right? It initially began with the politics, but now new social history, past 20, 30 years, is focusing on the immigrant experiences. But families like my families talk about this all the time. It's families became divided, and a few years ago, I used to organize before COVID, Immigrant Ohio on campus. And 1 year we focused on refugees, and we brought people group of people from all across the world, from Cuba to North Korea to South Korea, but there was also a Pakistani woman who was in India at the time, whose family moved to Pakistan, and she told her story as a young child. What happened? She was a teenager at the end of that. And then there was another Indian family in Toledo who lost their father. They never found him. They migrated, and he told the story of migrating on feet, on foot, because he said, no shoes on the feet because the shoes got destroyed. And then one day the brother went someplace, and they would be curfew at night, the elder brother, and there were no phones at the time, so he stayed in his friend's house, but the father didn't know that. He went looking for him on his bicycle, and they never found him. Then the police gave him some clothes. And that's the story, right? So people still live with the trauma of partition. It's a horrendous story, but it's a story that has been repeated since 47 in different parts of the world. Right?
And then for Indian people, or Pakistan people, to be resentful for Britain and her allies.
Yeah.
Doing that.
So
this is what the impression I have from these young ladies.
So, yes, history always is a blame game, right? You didn't do this, you didn't do this. But what is sad is that how the line was drawn. And how, India is a very multi-ethnic nation, multi-religious nation. And people for centuries lived together without any thinking about, differences. It's like we are neighbors. But in partition, neighbors turn against each other. And so there is a little, resentment, but people actively bought into that brand and they participated in that. That also is true. But there's a book by Kushal, there's a short story, Train to Pakistan. Read that. It's a really emotional story. It's a time, I think in the 60s, when the train traffic opened between the two nations, and the man is taking his mother. Are they going someplace, and I'm going to start crying because the movie's so. I've seen the movie too, and there's a little. Read that book. It's emotional. I'll talk to it afterwards. I don't want tears on this. But it's these are stories that, you living in Northern California, right, you hear since growing up, not really understanding the situation, but you, right, my dad's story, my aunt's story. And these are horrendous stories, but if you do an oral history, it's being done. The stories that I've heard have not been taught. So watch that film Earth, it is phenomenal, and it's a true story.
Can you say something about East Pakistan and West Pakistan and how planes couldn't fly through India and had to go all the way around the Indian Ocean and come back around to get to
Yeah.
East Pakistan?
So when the partition was decided, so it was solely based on religion. So there were religious groups in, if this is Pakistan, can we have the other map, please? So that is Pakistan, and where it says Tripura, next to West Bengal, that gray area is Bangladesh now. But at the time, these two areas had huge Muslim population. So they were carved out as a separate Pakistan, although there was so much distance, thousands of miles different, distance between them. And so Bangladesh was ruled by Pakistan from Rawalpindi, Islamabad, and then because of wars, India has had 3 wars, maybe 4 wars with Pakistan. There's in 1948, 62, 65, and no, 65, 71, and then skirmishes, or I don't as far beyond 1999. The country. So because of war, we are neighbors, but there is no relationship. It's difficult for me to go to Pakistan than to come to the US. Right? People usually don't get visas. It's only certain group of people. You go in a group, or if you're a journalist, or if you're a politician, or if you're an artist, then you can go to Pakistan. If I say I'm going to go to Pakistan, so it's during that time that they had to fly this way because the airspace was controlled by India and it wasn't letting any plane in Pakistan fly. So, and then at that time it was predicted that, controlling a nation or its territory that is thousands of miles away will not be possible. And in 71, Bangladesh became an independent, East Pakistan became Bangladesh, because ethnically they were different. They were more connected to Bengal on this side than to Pakistan. And the policies of Pakistan, they were looking at it as colonized territory. So in 1971, Bangladesh was created, and India had a hand in its creation too. Indian forces went in because there were a lot of atrocities, and Pakistan surrendered. And this is during 1711. Any words?
Can you comment on the fact that internationalism and that on different ethnicities of everything?
So, as I said, India is religiously and ethnically Hindus are the largest represented population. And significant population is Muslims, Sikhs, and other religions too, they could be Buddhists. During Mrs. Gandhi's time, there was the Babri Masjid crisis. It's a mosque, it's not mentioned here. A mosque in a small town was seen, somebody came up and said, this mosque, this is where Lord Ram was born. The mosque exists on a place where there was a temple, and that was the birthplace of Lord Ram. There's no evidence to that. And that resulted in a resurgence of Hindu movement. And the current Prime Minister Modi is from the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is a Hindu nationalist party. And he has been, he came up of this act. That the government is supporting Muslims much more than is getting them their rights, so. He came based on that, but that was couched also in development policies, that India needs to develop, it's not developing fast enough. So these two became tied. The first, when he won, in the first time, it was definitely the Hindu nationalist movement. But now his support is eroding because people supported him more for development agenda than for, urban population. We need better streets, we need better, we need good jobs, those kind of things. As economic is, it's growing phenomenally, but the results of it are uneven. There's high unemployment among educated population or underemployment. So, but this internationalism is very much out there. Many politicians who have come up are part of the religious group, and they really try to curtail the personal law of Muslims. One of them could be, there was this there's a code, a civil code, and some of these things did not apply to Muslims, right? And that code is now, civil code is now uniform. So there is a lot of resentment among some Muslims, especially Muslim clerics, regarding this. And there were also, small little things that were happening at local areas or in states. In some universities or in some colleges, women were not allowed to wear, asked not to wear their hats. You can wear it outside, but once you enter the premises, you should. Personal little things. But then there's also opposition to this because India in some ways is a very secular place. So this political ideas, the larger people, they're like, we don't let them know who they are, at least in my community that I know and my friends, but Modi also is, I'm not going to say much because we are so yes, Hindu nationalism is there, but there is ebb and flow. People did select him for he came to power because of this Hindu banner. But then he had to grow, his party had to grow based on economic, right? And economically, India is growing. But now, since the past 4 or 5 years, there's a lot of tension. Jobs are. And big government, India always have a big government. But the big company, if it has to meet its, balance its budgets. It's going to be, it's creating problems. So there has been, so the past few years, there have been a lot of struggles in some ways against the farmers. Or farmers have risen against Modi's government and they've been pretty successful. So there are these movements happening here and there. But like at one point, I think recently he tried to, government is the largest employer. They tried to curtail, start contract jobs rather than pension jobs. And the jobs, and so even in the armed forces, we would hire people on 5-year basis or as need basis, and there would be volunteer army. And then there would be a fixed army. And people rebelled because in many areas, armed forces jobs are the best jobs. Or even the government jobs are the best jobs. There is this tension in how much he can succeed. He's trying to fall in some ways, the American politics of limited government and stuff hasn't succeeded. So
I'm interested in this book, the other 1%. And in the text about the very educated, successful, wealthy, influential sector of our economy that is Indian. And I grew up in South Boston, and I remember that my neighbors sent guns to the IRA. They were Americans, but they were Irish. You think of Jewish contacts with Israel. Is there anything like that amongst the 1%? Are they still involved in India?
Oh my God. Yes. One of the largest rally ever that happened in USA was for Modi in Houston. I think it's mentioned here. Indian diaspora is very, very active. They have become news, right? In India, they were news, but they are now. They're propagating, I would go to the Indian community, family gatherings, and the men are sitting in, these are very gender gatherings. The women sort of associate with the kitchen and talk about their own business, and the men are talking, initially about the cars, their jobs, their, stock market and stuff, and then they would talk about Indian politics. It's like they never left India, and I would always, I would be between both groups, and I would argue with both. And I was like, we should be talking about US politics rather than Indian politics. They were very active politically here too, right? But in their own confines of their own, maybe volunteered here and there. But they were so much involved. I mean, the passion that I saw, it's like they never left India. And they were all Modi supporters. Modi, when elections are held, there are groups here that do phone banks kind of thing for India, I've heard. So Modi has a lot of support. Modi is from the state of Gujarat in Western India. You see that Gujarat? And Gujarati diaspora, Gujaratis have always been, there are business communities that have always been very mobile. So in Africa, a lot of Indian diaspora is Gujarati diaspora. So Gujaratis are very proud of him, very proud of the Gujarati identity, but they are also they're mixed. They're also the Indian the BJP have a party here, in has a US Midwest. And they are very active. They're very aware, very active. And sometimes I get into arguments with them, which are, I don't hold back. and so it's, I'm a woman, and that also sometimes shocks them. But the first time they started, expressing my views, they were like, how could you talk to us like that? And then they started joking. You always argue, you're a feminist. Recognizing so are your wives and your daughters. They try to put you in your place, honestly, right? But then they realize that I won't keep quiet, and then they say, you're a professor. So there's easy banter that goes, but yes, they're very involved. But the other thing they're involved in, BJP ascendancy is only in the 21st century. Before that, Indian diaspora, which started coming in 1960. I think that's exactly what giving a lecture on this. It started coming after 1960, when the immigration policy opened and allowed Indians to come in. Before that, Indians could not come. Very few people know that, right? The US immigration policy was very race-based. And only Western Europeans were allowed. Even Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans, if some of you are Greeks, you were not considered white enough. It was based on racial ideology. So in 1965, the rule changed. The immigration policy changed. That is the policy we are arguing right now. Right? That is the policy. It was good for 1960 and 70, but it had problems. And since I've been here in the past 3 years, I keep thinking this administration is going to resolve this problem. And the problems you guys know has to be resolved, right? And it's the problem of the undocumented. Because the 65 law does not say anything about undocumented. It looked at the old law, 1924 law, and made changes to that. 1924 and 1950 made changes to that, but it did not allow anything. So there's this 11 million people who exist, but the state doesn't see them. And they didn't come yesterday, they've been here since 1980s. Most of the undocumented have been here for a decade and more. And so it's the failure of this policy, and now there are silos created and nobody is willing to change their position. Right? In this whole, so 1965, but most of the Indians who started coming after 65 were already in the US in 1950s. And this is the result of India's colonial past. It became independent in 47, but in colonialism, you don't want the colonized population to be the rulers, right? You are the rulers. So there are very few institutional higher education in India in 1960s, in 1970s. So India expands education, but higher education is limited. So American universities and the USAID that's now being defined went to India, and some universities, technical universities in India, came through USAID funds. IIT Kanpur, Indian Institute of Technology, based on MIT, or these technical institutes, was made by US funds. And so all these professors, so there were the Big Ten, there was a consortium of universities, these are all the Ivy League and universities. They went and taught on a year basis, 2-year basis, contract basis in these universities. And they introduced students to American education. And so the first people who are coming here are coming for education. And in 1950s, during Cold War, as US is expanding, if you look at federal grants, there is what we call the military industrial complex. And there is huge investment in science infrastructure. You need people who are educated to work on these science, right? So from 1950s onward, if you look at the National Science Foundation or anything, there are manpower reports coming out that keep saying, we need more scientists, and it's projected. It takes money and time to create a PhD. By 60s, there were enough. So US, in its existing policy, tried what they call brain drain, right? It's a term, and it's the British sociologists behind the term brain drain. And he says, England has produced its doctors and scientists from America, because America just stopped here. And he says, our brains are great, but how many scientific people did it have? How many scientists, they took German, they took French, European. But then there was a huge pool of education, people getting educated in American universities. And these people became scientific. And these were the first 4 people who were in 1952 Act. There's also a new act that is created. It's known as the Temporary Worker Act, right? The H-1B visa. You guys are familiar, right? It's a temporary worker visa for high school people. What's created? Years. 2 and 3 apply, maximum up to 6 years. But then, what do you do? 1952 law also created another thing. It allowed international students to get training in the US in your field. So you are a scientist, let's say you have a degree in biology, you've got a job. You work as an intern, as a part of, when you train. The employer sees you, looks at your potential, and asks you, would you like to stay here? Yes, and so H-1B visa was employer-based, so the employer wrote to the Department of Labor saying, we need this person. The visa was running, and the person became a citizen. So, yes, temporarily, problem was resolved. But 1965 Act, in fact, validated this, and it created new categories for people who would come here, and it created 7 categories. 2 of these categories were occupational people. People with, so there were 2 categories. Actually, I became here in the USA, and most of the professors based on those 2 occupation categories. But if you are needed here and you get a job here, your employer files does the paperwork to get you here. So most of the Indians came in that category, and then they invited their family members to come. So Indian diaspora is the largest. In fact, it's so highly educated that when I looked at my study in 1980 census, I think close to 10% of Indians had PhD. No other group stands. So it is. Did I answer the question? Or just went over? But I do so.
They were from India. And I was visiting with them individually, whatever. And they both mentioned that they were Brahmin. And I hope I didn't, I was shocked because I thought that the caste system had quit. Has it not?
Officially, it doesn't exist. It was when you read your paper, a university will not discriminate against any paper that you see from government, not discriminate against based on gender, whatever. It's the same. But socially, these things do exist. So officially, we don't tally who's a Brahmin or who's not a Brahmin, right? But after independence, the caste system transferred into classes. The old higher caste became the new. But they, it became transferred into class. So the lower classes have done really well. What people don't realize is India is the first nation to have an affirmative action system. In 1940, it's based in their Indian constitution, that the lower castes, which were comprised about 15% of Indian population, they have been historically denied. So most of any government jobs, 15% of jobs must be for these what they call scheduled castes. And 7.5% of Indians are tribal people. They also were, living separately in some ways. So they also should be given these opportunities. So 22.5% of federal jobs should be for these groups, right? To create equities. But there have been 2 movements as unemployment among educated increase. They are targeting these quota systems, right? And in 1990s, I think, or 80s, okay, there was a huge student movement that said, give us jobs and deny, don't give jobs based on, people's caste. give us jobs. It didn't succeed, but in some states, I was told, yeah, this is sort of anecdotally. So this is a federal policy, and then states have their own policy. And it depends on the state population of these castes, and there's a federal register that was. So in some states, if the person making much money. And so they said a lot of those economics, the high class people are leaving India because they have the opportunities, they have the education, they have the means to do it. Right. So, did I answer your question? Yes,
We should probably get on to today's topic.
we should. See, a lot of this is part of what it's there. It's a lot more based on foreign policy and strategic, geopolitical things. But you can't talk about India without some of these things. I saw one here, and then after that. Yeah. Here at the university, and I'm also interested in today. Because I saw yeah. Could you share more on yes, Molly and Tom are great friends. Molly is known to give bear hugs to leaders. And when we hear that President Trump is a germaphobe, but he does fight. The relationship is there. The relationship is not just personal relationships do matter. In fact, President Trump in his early first term, went to India and had a huge, one of the largest rallies. Thanks to Modi supporters in India, right? But set aside, the personal relationship. These people are representing their nation, right? And so there are nations, demands, or even needs that sometimes clash. One of the biggest things that has been happening in Indian newspapers that you see the deportation slides. What we don't realize is a lot of Indians are undocumented. Many of them are coming, especially in the past decade, through southern borders, through the Guardian Gap, Costa Rica, Panama, Costa Rica, and seek asylum based on being tortured as a Sikh, right? Which probably is not a reality, but in the US documents being separated, if you show evidence or something, you're allowed. You get asylum. So they are seeking this. But then there is also, so they present themselves to be immigration officials and seek asylum. But a lot of people whose asylum were not, or sometimes some people had just entered, they were sent back to India. In one of these discussions, President Trump and Modi said in 30 days, there are citizens, we take them back. And so these flights are taking place. And there's a lot of people who fly in India because it's been or put in shackles. Their hands, this is what they're doing with deportation. In fact, I recently was reading that one of the government website has this video up there, and it created a lot of anger even among Americans. They shackle your, the ankles, and then your hands also. It's only men, and then you just walk like them. And so there is the disrespect that is being shown. There's a lot of anger. But even among people, they were not the way people spoke and the way they were approached in the way. So Indian newspapers are full of these in the past. But then the other thing is there's this trade issue. Nations now face trade with each other. And it's the issue of tariffs. India had huge tariffs for some of the American products. And part of the reason is they say we have, in India, they call them high duties. They don't use the word tariff so much. High duties, so that Indian products can work. Indian manufacturer or whatever, high-tech things, and then, some of that has come down, and that's what India has developed, in terms of IT, it has just grown. In terms of some of the apps, India in some ways is, for the common people, it's the new technology has changed India. A car pusher will have a phone, right? You can communicate. They call you, I have this, so if you are, say, that's regular of a person who really buys stuff. Person will say, I've got these matters today, you call me, do you want some? Right, so it's that kind of business, right? The other thing that I see is this app called ATM, it's like Apple Wallet. Every person, I think cash transactions are just become so limited, it makes it like here in country. Everybody uses ATM. And they, you buy something, you just press some buttons, and then they like, if you receive it, they ask for a code, you give them the code. I have not seen that here. The amount of digital infrastructure that has increased in India for common people, I don't see that here now. And they are surprisingly behind the curve in all the technology. And I don't really track it in some ways, but they have this question. You live in the US. How come you don't know this? And I tell them, we don't use so much. The younger generation uses Venmos and the others, apps. My generation, we still use our credit cards, we still use cash. Over there, every becoming so important. It is. And a friend of mine who works in IT support here in the Gita company said the same. There's a vibrancy in here in terms of the economy, in terms of India. When you go to a city, there's movement, there's action. And I am stunned at that because that wasn't what it was. Right? So you see this, the new economy, you see the consumers shops, one of the biggest markets. India is one of the biggest markets, right? What I see is only in a big city, in an urban area, but the growth is very uneven. Right? It has some of the richest people, but it also has the GDP is one of the lowest because it's not distributed. Right? So that there's a real effect. Rural areas are still stagnant behind. Manufacturing is stagnant, or it's slowing down. So India is a study in contrast. You get everything. Indian middle class is bigger than US population. Population of 1.4 billion. If the middle class is 333 million, or 300 something, that's US population. And businesses globally have found that, and so you see in India the top class malls that I've never seen in Midwest. Right? So in some ways, you just go there to see how the other half of them. But people are why we economize idiots. Where do you get the money from? But it's this kind of conspicuous consumption in debt, especially in money. There are lots there. So there is something is going on there. Every time I go, I learn something. I learn something new, and I feel. And they tell me you were in the hollow, and I feel that way. So, any other questions, or shall we now talk about the? Okay. I didn't know how many people were coming, I didn't know. How to prepare for this. This is not the first time I'm doing it, but I always keep forgetting about this. Normally when I teach a class, I go back and forth, I know. You know, here I'm told to stand steps, I'm just gonna. It's gonna be a little hard, so, what am I doing? What I do in my class? I don't know, it's copious notes, but since you have, you just go, we can stop me anytime. We just go over a few things, few bullet points, and then we start on. So the author begins with you talking about India, we all know it's the most populated country, it overtook China a few years ago, 1.4 million people. It is also the largest democracy, and people do vote in much higher percentage than India. I mean, yes, and people also. I delve into stories a lot, and I'm going to bring in this case a lot of personal stories. Here right now, you can't have a political discussion, media voting. There's a wars, like war stories. I tell everybody here who I talk to. My parents usually voted for different parties. Right? So my mom, if you see my mom, it's very false. You know, ideas. My dad's a boss. He used to be, now he complains he no longer has control of me, right? And my dad, as kids, we saw that as we were growing up. He would start a few days before talking about Mrs. Gandhi. And how, you know, she was government was so corrupt, you know, they didn't do anything, it's my mom just. And then he knew she was a supporter of Mrs. Gandhi. So then days later after the election, they were all the neighbors, you know, I don't see this here, the neighbors, all these old people would walk together. To the election. Polling place, and the polling day was usually a national holiday. So they would go there together, there was a lot of, you know, good stuff. And days after my dad asked my mom, "What did you vote?" There was a public campaign which was like, your vote is a secret, you don't have to tell anyone. She would go that. She never told them, they knew. You know, I think now they're both being turned off from their parties, they voted for theirs, like now a new party that, which is anti-corruption, which is more pro-development. I asked my senses, the way my dad talks about some of these people, they both become odd people, you know, the AAP part. So the largest democracy, and it is emerging as a new superpower. It has been intent, right? The author talks about India's economic growth, stupendous in some way. It also talks about India's geopolitical situation. And also what the author is trying to say is US-India partnership is what is now growing. It is becoming, US is looking at India as a partner. And part of it is not just for economic reasons, but also for its geopolitical location and to try and control China, right? Because you know China is just, China is just going through various, it's becoming, it is an economic powerhouse, and it is, it has a very active foreign policy that we rarely talk about. It is not giving loans and to countries in Africa, in the small Indian Ocean, you know, the small island nations. Yesterday there was, it's having, you know, yesterday or day before there was news that they're having military exercise off of Indonesia. It's flags for straight barricading. You know, going from India to Pakistan, all kind of flights have to be diverted or have to take longer. Right? So India's situation also is leading USA to create a new alliance with India, right? It's political, it's technical, but it's also trade-based, right? And so, there are many reasons that the authors talk about here, right? India is the fifth largest economy, but the author does talk about a lot of challenges that it faces at this point. Policy inaction, action. When action, like they are taking some action, people are saying this is not okay, the farmers, this is regarding pricing policy, regarding the crops and stuff. And the farmers are advocating, you can't do that, so it's very hard to change policy that, affects a lot of people. There's low labor force participation, especially among women. Wages in the past 10, 15 years are lower than back then. Half of the population is driven by agriculture, and the author says bureaucracy is widespread and it's inefficient. So you see the stories that you can have one movie and Trump heartbreak. But what the author says is new opportunities are also emerging between India and China. India new cooperation, right? The author says India's greatest asset is its population, but there is, in this age of technology, people can see everything, right? Through these TikTok videos, through these WhatsApp, that they're circulating. And then these but with stagnant wages and with a high unemployment, things become tense for you. I'll give you an example of that. He says he wants to get a better job. And then at this time, I was like, did you apply? What happened? Then I saw him a few months ago. And he said, no. He says, I'm here. I'm okay. He said, now there are contract jobs, like 4 years, 2 years, and people are firing people. Big companies are firing them first. And so he says, right now, job security is what matters. He's 24, 25. He says, I can wait. Right? But so what you see is, and this is in his generation. Your friends who, went to technical colleges did fine, but others are struggling. But India also is becoming, showing its face and its hand globally, and it's become very active. It has a pragmatic foreign policy. It's going to playing a strategic role, and a couple of years ago, 2023, India hosted the G20. The group's annual meeting was held in Delhi, and Delhi changed. It was beautiful, right? And then so India is sort of sees itself as an active in global development. I'll talk a little bit later about what the India's foreign policy or its vision is, but I'm going to go back to history a little bit, right? And so the author says now India has a very cozy relationship with the US and increases for part of it is based on the geopolitical realities of 1940s, 90s. So India became independent in 1947. At the time, this is the beginning of the war. It's an ideological war, and it's a war between capitalism and socialism or communism. And India, in some ways, Nehru was the founding, kind of the first prime minister and leader of the Congress Party. His aim was to keep away from both the bipolar system and start a new movement where you were not tied to an ideology or to a nation. And so in 1950s, India was one of the proponents of this new movement called non-aligned movement. It would either be aligned with USA or USSR, we would be friends with both. The non-aligned movement, I think the Bandung Conference in 1950s, it came together. And a lot of what, were known at the time as the newly emerging republics, newly emerging nations were part of this. And so India kept its distance from both, but we would see that India, because of its own security conditions, was becoming alienated from the US. So in Cold War, there were multiple alliances. You guys know NATO as well, and that is under threat. But there were two other ones, which one was Seattle, Southeast Asia Nations Organization, and then there was Central, I think, Central Asian Organization. Iran, Pakistan, all became part of that. India was not part. India also had its own tension with Pakistan. And so Pakistan, India, US depended more on Pakistan. And India had two wars, its own domestic concerns, 65 war with Pakistan, and these wars were over the province of Kashmir, and then 71 war. And both these wars, US supplied armaments to Pakistan. And so there's like a movement away from Pakistan, away from US. So India is going more and more into the USSR. And in 1971, Mrs. Gandhi and the USSR president, I think it was Brezhnev. No, Brezhnev. I don't remember. They formed a pact. It's a treaty where US said we support you, and USSR also started armaments to India. So Indian armed forces really had made a lot of things, equipment and resources. And so, and during 1971 war, the US sent its seventh fleet to Indian Ocean, which was like a huge human cry. So Indians at the time, and Indian government saw US-Pakistan relationship as competing US. But then the other thing is, domestically, India was modernized. So Nehru's aim was to colonize countries. And no, there's colonies, they don't get any infrastructure. They are seen as resort of extraction rather than investment. So Nehru's idea was, Nehru was educated in Europe, and his idea was, we need to, and many of these new nations, we need to develop and come to the level of the other nations. So Nehru's economic policies focused on 5-year plans. These 5-year plans, first 5-year plans, invested heavily in rapid industrialization and education, because you needed people to be who could run these industries. So the first two, there's rapid industrialization, but then there's high unemployment. And many of these people are coming to US or to England, in 1950s and 60s. They are leaving India ostensibly to get higher education, but then they get jobs here and they didn't come back, or maybe even went back, didn't find jobs that were they thought were commensurate with their skills. So they came back here. So there is, and then the agriculture sector lagged. So in the following subsequent plans, agriculture, investment in irrigation, was state investment in agriculture, and because our areas were growing, rural areas remain stagnant in terms of production, in terms of quality of life. So subsequent plan was for investing in rural areas. The idea was that India wanted to be self-sufficient, and a lot of multinational. So any company, I think Mrs. Gandhi's there's a new law instituted that you had to share the know-how with Indians. If you had a company, you had to share the know-how. Whereas USSR, in some ways, did not. Many of the components and stuff were produced in India, so they could take them off. So, and in fact, just a sidebar, in 77, 78, when this happened, a lot of multinationals left India. And the Indian companies like IBM, left India. And the Indians who work for these companies started their own companies. It could be IBM or something. And the technical revolution that is like, argue that it was the result of this. They were highly educated people, they had experiences in these multinationals, and then they took over and ran with it. Right? So in some ways these laws, and India-Pakistan relationship was also, as I said, strained because of this. So US was thinking in terms of global, and India just fitted into that global picture. And if it wasn't part of this alliance, India didn't really exist, right? And India's desire for a US relationship was through India-Pakistan connection. You are supplying weapons to Pakistan, stop doing that, because they're being used against us. But in 1990, as the Soviet Union declines, and then breaks, and as a new geopolitical threat emerges for the US, which is the Al-Qaeda and war on terrorists, that's where a new relationship is being formed. So it's a changing geopolitical system that starts a new relationship. Part of it is by that time, Indian diaspora is existing, right? And they are putting political pressure, although there aren't too many of them. They work in higher positions. They are one of the largest contributors to the whole party. They were still two of the people who came. It's the scientists or engineers, or it's the doctors. Both of them make good money. And so I remember talking to one person in the Detroit area, which is my parents, and he said, this is the time. All these people's parties and their representatives are coming because they're seeking funds from us. And he said, well, if I ever go to DC, I can go walk into a representative's office, because he says, we got right, and he's a good as well. So, but it's the largest thing that is happening here in changing relationship in others because of the geopolitics, right? Very few people know that Al-Qaeda's first target was India. And Indians in 1980s and 90s, Indian Airlines flights were being hijacked in Afghanistan. Stopover in Pakistan were refueled, and then in Afghanistan. And so this is the Al-Qaeda operation. So when 9/11 happened, or earlier on, US had limited information on Al-Qaeda. A lot of this information, this is from a friend who was in the article. He said US eyes were not there, right? On the details, the depth of information that's immediate. So what starts is a new defense relationship in 1990s, especially in 2001, and these relationships have continued. As the USSR has faltered, and after its demise, the new trade relationship. Yes. And so to India. Obama went twice to India. President Trump has been there, and before that, Trump was president. The new relations. So since, especially in the 21st century, the relationship is growing, right? 9/11, also global partnerships in terms of vision. Both are democratic nations. They do talk about their democracy. President's tying them. There is a lot of defense agreements. This article lists so many of them. I wasn't aware of most of them. I know there exist, but what these are, a lot of it is also in terms of the AI and the new technology. That also there are those, relationships, and US also has permitted some companies to produce their parts in India, right? Lockheed Martin and other companies. So this shows a new confidence, a new relationship among companies, a feeling that India will survive. In 1970s, 80s, India was at times threatening on, collapse. And also in 1990s, Indian economy was focused primarily on, socialistic principles, bringing everybody up. But so there was a lot of investment in Indian government. There's a reserve in property taxes. So in 1990s, Indian economy is on the brink of collapse. And Manmohan Singh, which is India's prime minister, he was a technocrat. The economic secretary of the time was educated in England. He was asked to be the prime minister, and he said, and he's a technician, right? He's a bureaucrat. And he refused until he said he changed certain founding principles of Indian policy, right? And Narasimha Rao, the prime minister at the time, said yes, because India was about to default on its debt. And so there were a lot of, World Bank and IMF loans, and India survived that and came out of it. So the Indian policies, in some of the economic policies, changed. It allowed for foreign investment. Under Manmohan Singh, foreign investment increased in India because Indian government permitted to change their route. And so this economic and trade partnership is growing in this new environment. The diaspora is also the relation, is also the reason why this relation. Shared values, defense cooperation, economic investment, technical relationships, they're all integrated in there. The challenges that remain. And the other thing is the rise of China. Russia is a Spanish force in some ways. Who's the new enemies, economic and in terms of geopolitical issues with China. And so India in some ways has a new relationship. What you see is that the US has been involved in, I know there are being defense cooperations, most of them are rarely talked about. There have been some exercises off the coast of, within the Indian Ocean. US is also focusing on the new cooperations. These are in Japan, Australia, India, they're all becoming part of the new alliance that started in 21st century. And the US is looking at India as a partner, right? But challenges do remain. And these challenges came before, during the Ukraine war. India did not join the US and Western backed embargoes of Russia, and part of it is how you really get your oil. It's the domestic compulsion, and the oil became much cheaper, and they created much more oil out during the war. So India is trying to balance itself. It is, again, it's in some ways non-aligned, and says it is putting pressure on Putin. It's also has a relationship with Ukraine. And so what it's trying to balance itself. But the authors say, tariffs remain part of the tension. President Trump said, every nation, whatever percentage tariffs they have on US products, we will have the same tariffs on their products, right? So that tariff question is there. But the thing is, there is friendly relations, and there is hope that something will survive, right? But the author ends by saying, India wants to be a superpower. It's at the door, it's asking for a seat in the UN Security Council, which China is blocking. The Western nations are okay with that. But it's not unilaterally, it's not talking about it, it's talking about BRICS nation. It's like multilateral. You need to include not just the nations that were involved in the 1940s, nations that are important in the 21st century. It could be South Africa, it could be, so it's talking, it's taking a new view. But, what is the yardstick to be a superpower? It's, India doesn't have resources. Its resources are very limited and they're mostly to neighboring countries. But it has been paid in other forms of technical know-how in distribution of COVID vaccines. COVID shield was, African nations were getting their COVID vaccines from India and China. The Chinese were not seen as successful. The COVID shield was being distributed all across in many nations. India has a large army, so it's also helping in peacekeeping and trying to maintain a balance in some ways. Let's see where it goes in the next 20 years, 25 years. It has come a long way. The India I left 30 years ago is not the India now. I go there and I feel I'm a stranger. It has grown so much. When I went, very few people had cars. Now there's no parking because every family has 2 cars. Those streets were not made for, it's the consumerism that you see there, as I said, it's a everything that I grew up with doesn't exist. It's a new India. And I see this in my family, I see this in my friends who I connect with. I live in the India of the 1990s when I left, whereas India has grown, right? And Bowling Green allows you to live like that. Right? So I'm behind the curve as they keep telling me my family. India has grown. And you see this for the challenges, the inequalities. Streets are still sometimes not as good, dirt is there, you get highways that are like here. I remember I took some friends from here, all these. We went to India for a vacation and we went from Delhi to Agra, highway to the toll road. There was nobody there. And the driver was like, this is such a boring street, this is like honestly. Because he said nothing, and they can't be any cars because there are these living on the sides with huge pylons. So no, the animals even cannot come there. It's a new wall that they're creating. So there are new roads. Infrastructure buildup is phenomenal. Roads could be as good, but then you have Booster Street could be a road that could be anywhere. But Grove Street would be still its own form, right? So there is this unevenness. But it's a vibrant place. If anybody goes to India, please right? So now there's very little time left, but if you have any questions, yes, sir.
What is the cause of this tension between China and India? I mean, looking at the map, read about this, I mean, up there where the fighting takes place, I mean, your chances of freezing to death. I mean, your chance of freezing to death is greater than anything else. What is there to fight them? Why wouldn't China cooperate and they would be a super
That was the plan of Nehru. And he thought China was his best friend in 1950s. In fact, there is China came to India in 1950s or 60s, and they were like talking about Nehru, China, Bhai, like they were 2 brothers. And then China invaded in 60s. India didn't have any armed forces. Basically, in the few they did, it was that. So China just walked in this. Can we have the other one, please? In the Assam area, that they just basically, so it is territorial. And then there's also, if you go and push the color, it's territorial emissions, it's geopolitical, it's controlling economics. We have a natural barrier between India and China. This is the and some of the fight in this century has taken place in those coldest areas, and it has been hand-to-hand fight. It's but but it exists, it's China's expansionist, I guess, in some ways. And there's nothing there except you get to stand on the mountain and you can shoot whoever you want, you know, you can.
Then we're fighting.
They could be some mineral, you don't know, right? But this. Not there to control the resources. And what? It's a big thing, right? But the 5 rivers, well, yes, I'm just so India's agriculture, all the rivers flowing from here.
Right.
They even from Pakistan. Yeah, so okay, 1962-5 changed India. And I think also resulted in buildup of Indian army and also India's, it kept talking about non-alignment. But then it went into Russia's lap. You know, those friendships started.
I was initially kind of confused. It's still created through the Turkish. Putin, trying to come back to the Western invasion sanctions. But, trying to play both sides against the middle. But it's now considered part of the global south, which is also considered developing countries, and India certainly is not a developing country.
Yes, we make this.
In the global south, what is the difference between the global south and the third world countries? And secondly, is the main intent of this association, global south countries, an attempt to demand a greater share of planet resources?
So the term third world and global south in some ways became intermixed. Third world was developing countries, right? The first one were the US, you know, and the rest of the developed nations. Second one were the social economic. Very seen as economically undeveloped or underdeveloped. And then the term came later on, developing societies. And then global south, north of the south. North was the rich people, you know, rich nations. South was
You're north of the equator.
I think it was not north south per se, it was in terms of development. It's equator maybe in meaning and might have been thinking of Africa and other countries, but south became the term economically that were not hadn't progressed at the level. You know, I don't know what the yardstick is to be from. South go from south to the north. So India is many nations. You would see places that would fit into Bowling Green, you would have no problem. There, you know, but then there is also huge pockets that are underdeveloped. So India is not a uniform country, it has multiple nations in terms of development, in terms of access to resources. So the old global order was based in is based in the 1950s, 1940s, right? It's still established based on the Cold War context, right? And in Cold War context, these nations were also economically developed in 1940s. 50 years later, that same equation doesn't exist anymore. The world has changed. And so, you know, the new nations that have come up, which are coming up, they want a seat at the table too. And they're saying, listen to us. So that's why, you know, in 1990s, I think the big nations, came, they formed a new consortium. Where they said, we need a seat at the table too. And they are the ones who have become the new South. So when India's foreign policy, it's not just asking for it, it's asking for representation from these new colonies. South Africa is the same way. Brazil is the same way, you know. It's uneven development, but in terms of population, in terms of land, in terms of, you know, regional location and regional influence, these are huge nations. So they are asking for a seat at the table. And also, you know, becoming independent of various nations. I mean, when India said, we will not be part of this. They get their domestic oil production, oil needs, the energy needs, the fact that the energy needs are huge. And Russia is a huge provider. So, you know, so these, the global south, in some ways, in countries that were in maybe 50 years, economically undeveloped, you know, didn't know much, didn't have much power globally. But they are now on the rise, and the West is declining. Look at Europe. Europe is the economy is far in a decline. I mean, look at England, look at look at Germany. They will not be Germany, you know, 50 years ago, they're not be, so, and the new economies that are going are in the global south. You know, Indian GDP is, growth is 7.2%. It's like, what? Right? And US, when you have 2 or 3%, we say it's a good growth year. Because the potential for, they were here, the potential for them is it's growing fast. But again, it's very uneven. And so it's that global south. It's not terms, it's economically, it's in much better place than it was 50 years. Geopolitically, all these great nations are where the new center of activity. And the other thing is, India is also coming up with this new initiative of the Middle East corridor. I didn't talk about this. Are you familiar with Belgium? Belgium, right? So China has a new initiative, I think in 2010, 14 or something, where they're going to the old Silk Road, where the developing nations are, you know, investing in them and everything. So those nations are going to be tied to China, and then other nations that are coming off from the Silk Road, you know, those drugs. So that's a new initiative. So building a new economic growth along those lines, and people will also become the spheres of it. So India at the 2023 G20 proposed a to counteract that, and they have a Middle East corridor. So you start from India, run through Middle Eastern nations to Europe, and connect with Europe. So this is the new, there's a name for it, I'm just calling it Middle Eastern corridor. I think that the author talks maybe one sentence about it. But this is huge. I mean, when you read the communique on the G20, it had a huge, I had never heard of that. So I started, you know, reading the communiques, and they are trying to show its new relevance in some ways, globally, right? And that would be the goal. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Any other questions? We are at 11 p.m. I was telling Deborah when she reminded me that I had a, you know, I had to come give a talk. I said,